and madly teach. Chapter 1. Concerning the author's bias. There is something condescending and faintly derogatory about the term layman, once used to designate anyone who was not a member of the clergy. In our secular age, it is an expression employed chiefly by professionals and experts in referring to one untrained in their particular disciplines, and its use is often accompanied, sometimes unwittingly, but more often with malice aforethought, by a suggestion that the speaker is using it as a synonym for ignoramus. One doesn't mind this if the speaker is a physicist like Einstein or a surrealist painter. The subject matter with which both deal is largely beyond the comprehension of the ordinary mind, and any opinions one may have can only be tentative and offered in all humility. Except for newspaper columnists and book reviewers, we can't all have universal minds, comfortably and cozily at home in all fields of human endeavor. But one of the less fortunate results of the modern scientific temper is a tendency to divide things that shouldn't be divided into exclusive areas where only the expert is supposed to operate effectively. Today, one of these things is public school education. It has been taken over by a coterie of experts who have erected it into an esoteric science, which every prospect pleases and only the amateur is vile. But education is not so mysterious that it will yield its secrets only to the specialist. After all, practically every adult has been subjected to some amount of formal education, and if he is not too dull-witted, he can observe and evaluate its effects on him personally, and he will also observe contemporary young people who are the end products of current education. This, then, is an essay about education by a layman and an amateur, and it is not written in sackcloth and ashes. It is written in the conviction that laymen, that is, parents and taxpayers, ought to get over their lazy indifference to the public schools and study the theory and practice of public school education. In short, to find out what it is we are paying for and to which we so glibly turn over our children. My own inclination was turned in this direction when by chance I had the opportunity to serve as a member of a board of education. This experience in a local situation whetted my appetite and prompted me, in trying to get beyond the parochial, to make forays outside my own bailiwick and finally to attempt to digest large portions of rather soggy educational literature. Before proceeding further, I feel I should speak a word of warning to anyone who intends to acquaint himself with the writings of modern educational theorists. It will be rough sledding, for the writings of most educators sound as if they've been badly translated from German. They are especially fond of making numbered lists of quote-unquote goals and objectives, and then making subdivisions of quote principles, factors, and implications. So the reader finds it extremely difficult to follow the dizzy flight of the original point and gets bogged down in cross-references. As an example of what I mean, I have recently been reading an article by a leading educator on administration, which he informs us consists of 3 primary functions, 8 elements, 9 basic principles, and 5 relationships. That our public schools are at the present time in a bad way is a notorious fact deplored by everyone, not least by the public school educator himself or herself. During the war, the armed services uncovered an appalling degree of illiteracy among recent school graduates. The immense popularity of comics and low-grade magazine literature, and in general the unwillingness to read anything that isn't accompanied by simple pictorial interpretation, seem to prove that what literacy there is among young people is of questionable value. From every side come complaints that the typical public school graduate can't spell or write a decent English sentence, that he is ignorant of the elementary facts of his country's history and completely muddled about the rest of the world. there also seems to be a general feeling that he is a socially irresponsible animal, and that this condition many prominent persons propose to correct by some sort of compulsory national training program, which would follow graduation from high school. In addition to the alleged inadequacies of the educational process, there are widespread complaints about the mechanical conditions prevailing in our schools: poor school plans, outmoded equipment, miserably paid teachers, etc., etc. As a non-professional with a limited knowledge of the subject, I am not prepared to testify that our public schools deserve such a sweeping indictment. But since educators themselves seem inclined to the feeling that universal education has not turned out to be the social panacea Horace Mann so optimistically envisioned 100 years ago, perhaps it is safe to suggest that all is not too rosy. Now, if it is agreed that our public schools are not all they should be, it may be salutary to ask ourselves, without trying to measure the enormity of their sins, what is wrong, to seek to find, if possible, some of the causes of the breakdown. It always impresses me when this question is asked how coy educators are about facing it frankly, how skittish they are when it comes to discussing what seem to me to be the primary causes behind the low estate of public schools. They are eloquent about poor equipment, dilapidated buildings, low salaries for teachers, and political-minded or ignorant boards of education, and they have a right to be. These conditions are widespread, and as far as I can see, educators contend with them with a patience and fortitude which can only be described as heroic. One gathers, however, that if these external handicaps could be eliminated, everything would be plain sailing. That is, if educators were permitted to work under ideal mechanical conditions, public school education would be a universal boon. But this supposition leaves untouched the whole vital question of educational theory. It leaves unanswered the question of what kind of education is going to go on in the million-dollar schools staffed by the well-paid teachers. That is the question this little book will attempt to answer, at least with the tentativeness proper to the novice. In other words, this book will deal almost entirely with theory, and its main thesis will be that what is wrong with public school education is its theoretical and philosophical basis. The reader at this point might object that I am a little presumptuous in assuming that there is an inclusive philosophy of education among public schoolmen. To this objection, I can only counter that if anyone would take the trouble to investigate, it will be found that those who make up the staffs of the schools and colleges of education, and the administrators and teachers whom they train to run the system, have a truly amazing uniformity of opinion regarding the aims, the content, and the methods of education. They constitute a cohesive body of believers with a clearly formulated set of dogmas and doctrines, and they are perpetuating the faith by seeing to it, through state laws and the rules of state departments of education, that only those teachers and administrators are certified who have been trained in correct dogma. There are, of course, still survivors among the teachers of an earlier order and an earlier faith who became part of the system before the present dispensation gained such complete control. But these are all older men and women who are rapidly reaching the retirement age, and when they are gone, the new order will reign supreme. I dare say that in another 10 years it will be almost impossible for a teacher who has not been indoctrinated with quote-unquote modern education to find a place in the public schools. Any proper book on education needs to begin with a definition and a statement of the author's particular bias. 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, the word education had a nearly universal meaning. Today, it has so many meanings and covers such a wide field that one can never be sure that two persons discussing it are talking about the same thing. When Robert M. Hutchins, or the head of a Jesuit college, discusses education, They will certainly be talking about a different breed of cats from what is meant when John Dewey, or the Dean of Teachers College, Columbia University, talks of education. The high school on the New Jersey coast, which gives girls academic credit for courses in seamanship, is operating under a theory of education which bears no relation to what goes on a few miles farther south at St. John's College, Annapolis, where education is confined largely to reading books. In broadest terms, education can be defined as the process of indiscriminate learning. That is, in any individual's education, it is what he knows, the sum total of the knowledge, information, and skills he has acquired along the way. For the purposes of this book, such a definition is obviously unsatisfactory. For it deals with a formal institution of education, the public schools, and any institution must have a function which is selective and specific, not indiscriminate and miscellaneous. The question then resolves itself into this: what should be the function of the public school, or of any school for that matter? Or what part of the total educative process should be specifically the task of the school? It is not possible, of course, to define a single isolated function and say to the schoolman, here is your task and your only task. There's a natural overlapping with every educational agency and influence, necessarily taking on some of the functions of all other educational agencies and influences. It is possible and indeed imperative, however, for any agency or institution of society, if it is to accomplish anything, to have a primary goal that takes precedence over all secondary goals. My own views about the proper end and function of formal education are, I admit, what might be called old-fashioned, and I realize that, at this point in my narrative, I run the risk of having a certain type of reader throw the book down with disgust as he grunts, reactionary. You will be of the not inconsiderable group of modern scientific thinkers who apply the terms old-fashioned and reactionary to almost everything man thought for 2,000 years, and who believe that the life of reason and the age of enlightenment began roughly about the year 1900. To use two terms currently held in great contempt, I think the task of the schools is chiefly intellectual and moral in nature. It must deal with ideas, and it must form ideals. In the lower grades, the primary task is to impart basic skills and elementary factual background, the 3 R's. But in the high school, and this is vitally important where the aim is education of the masses, most of whom will never have any further formal education, it is imperative that young people not only be trained in the utilitarian skills of mathematics, practical science, and languages, but that they learn about what we might call the spiritual history of mankind. The current emphasis on citizenship training in the schools is a sound idea only if teachers realize that what some of them contemptuously call the dead past is the chief clue to how we became political animals. I would agree with Sir Richard Livingston when he says that the 2 subjects most important to the secondary school are literature and history. Literature, says Sir Livingston, where all the visions of men are recorded, and history, where behind the confusion of unceasing movement the human spirit can be discerned weaving painfully and uncertainly a coherent design. I want to make myself entirely clear here. I am all for the schools trying to produce the well-rounded individual. I believe that those who want to learn manual skills, be it woodworking or cooking, should be given the opportunity as long as these remain more or less in the realm of play activities and are properly subordinated to serious academic study. Naturally, I'm in favor of physical training, but here again, it must fall into its proper subordinate place. Physical training can, and very often does, especially in small-town and rural communities, assume an exaggerated importance, the tendency being to highly organized recreational activity, particularly among the boys, to the neglect of natural, spontaneous play. Most physical educationists bow down before the great modern fetish of organization. The schoolman must look after many things: physical welfare, manual skills, practical talents. But primarily, he must see that first things come first, that his principal task is to transmit to his charges an understanding of how humankind got this way. Only out of that understanding and intelligence will come enjoyment of living, which is the real end of education. There is an atmosphere in our schools today which discourages the kind of education of which I speak. It is bad enough that the lower schools are failing to teach adequately the basic skills of reading, writing, and expression. What borders on the criminal is the poor teaching and neglect of those subjects that deal with the history of ideas and ideals, a knowledge of which is essential to all youth who would assume their place in society as thinking, feeling human beings. Our much-touted American ideal of education for all is a fake ideal, for it doesn't mean what it says. Under the present order, it only means that everyone will be trained to do something, and only by chance will a few be educated to become something. As I have suggested, our public schools have not drifted into their present state. It is a matter of cause and effect. There is a philosophy at work here, a philosophy that is a reflection of the general scientific and positivist spirit of our time. Public school education has been proceeding rapidly in the last 50 years in a direction opposed to the traditional conception of education. Under the impact of the modern temper, and fortified by considerations of practical contemporary conditions, schoolmen have reached the conclusion that education is not even secondarily an intellectual matter, and as for its being a moral matter, heaven forbid. That people are primarily doers rather than thinkers. That the essence of education, to quote John Dewey, is no more than, quote, vital energy seeking opportunity for effective exercise, unquote. This essay is an attempt to examine critically some of the outstanding doctrines of this new education. I shall begin by trying to give something of the background of the movement, a short history of the general philosophical position, and then go on to deal with specific individual doctrines.